Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to join in this debate. It's interesting. The last two debates I've been at has been mostly federally driven from the federal NDPs. You know, obviously there's not many issues in Saskatchewan, which we all know Saskatchewan is rolling good. The farming industry is rolling good. We're talking about this particular motion. You know, they talk about, I can remember about the wheat board. I can remember I was an auction sale when they announced the initial price. It was, I think, the early 90s, $1.87 was the initial price they were offering. And I remember how people were just, the farmers were just shaking their heads at that. A lot of years, barely 205, 2010. Why do you think the farmers switched to lentils, peas, mustard? And they did that with the private industry. The farmers are producing 65% of the world peas. I think 60% of the world lentils. There are 27% of the yellow mustard. Markets the farmers developed because they couldn't make a living under the wheat board. You know, the only help the wheat board offered at the end, after the farmers made them sales, worked with private industry, was, oh, we'll help you sell it now. You know, we'll help you sell it like we did the wheat all through the 70s, 80s, 90s, when the prices were almost at nothing. When instead of passing money on, they were building a palace in Winnipeg with our money. What else they do with our money? I don't remember being consulted when they bought ships. I don't remember that, spending the farmers' money buying anything they wanted. I can remember questions being raised why they don't ship more grain through the United States, through ports there, instead of going to Vancouver when there were strikes, because some of them ports weren't unionized. They wouldn't go down the Mississippi. They wanted to go through unionized ports. You know, this motion speaks back to the NDP of the 70s, when Blakeney used to thump around and about nationalization, about the wheat board and socialism. I remember the candidate Ferris in '74 coming to Bladworth and just extolling the futures of socialism, nationalism, how about co-ops and the wheat board, and then going, someday you'll see the light. And I remember my dad looking at him and says, if that's your idea of light, I'll keep stumbling along in the darkness. Hear, hear. You know, they talk about standing up for farmers. Well, we'll talk about that for a little bit. Last election, if you want to stand up for farmers, you couldn't even find a farmer in Arm River-Watrous to run against me. If the wheat board was such a huge issue that all the farmers were all going to vote for that, you couldn't find one farmer to run. In fact, you couldn't find anybody from Saskatchewan to run. The candidate was from Edmonton. He was working at the Regina Co-op refinery temporarily. Last I checked, he was still in Edmonton. Federally, you don't have a seat. And you have the eastern politicians telling us they're going to save the western grain farmers. You know, that reminds me of an old proverb I heard when I was a kid. You know, 5,000 years ago, Moses said, I'm going to lead my people to the promised land. He said, grab your shovels, put them on your asses, sorry, donkeys. Get on your camels. I will lead you to the promised land. What's Justin Trudeau saying now? I'll bring back the wheat board. Farmers, you can lay down your shovels, sit on your rear end, light up a camel, you're in the promised land. If the NDP were ever elected, each and every farmer and rancher would know what would happen. The NDP would take your camel, tax your shovel, kick you in the rear end and tell you there is no promised land. I'm tired of eastern politicians telling us how to sell our grain. When in Eastern Canada never had a wheat board. You tell them, Mulcair, go save Quebec, go save Ontario farmers first. Put a wheat board there, then come and tell us how to sell our grain. That's a premise of this motion. There's a lot of issues out there in rural Saskatchewan. This isn't one of them. You know, this isn't one of them with farmers. This is something from the 70s where the NDP don't even want to push to help farmers. This is about pushing their agenda of socialism, nationalization, and about the land banks back then. I can remember speaking about that, pushing that issue. We talk about the wheat board. Farmers have moved on. We can market our own grain. We do it with peas, we do it with lentils, we do it with mustard, we do it with every commodity that's out there. We can work with the private industry. We don't need Big Brother telling us how to sell grain. I can remember having no quotas. I can remember on the wheat board system, no quotas. You couldn't move grain. sitting on it, expecting us to store it. And when they did call a quota, it was maybe 3 bushels an acre. Now, through the 90s, they went to a contract system, but still they would call 25%. That's all you knew, the most you were going to be able to sell. And then maybe in February, they'd call another 25%. Maybe June, they'd finally call the last 50%. The rest of the time, we had to store it on our dollar. You know, farmers want the option, which we've used in the, she talked about a big crop year, which it was 2 years ago. Myself, a lot of my neighbours had wheat on the ground. I had to pile 10,000 bushels on the ground. There's grain bags. I moved that before the snow got to it because I could contract it all with the buyer and it was gone. Under the wheat board system, that pile would have stayed there and rotted through the winter under the wheat board. You know, when they talk about coming out here and from the federal NDP giving advice to the provincial NDP on how to run our farms. Well, like a member had mentioned, well, thank you for being concerned, but maybe be a little more concerned maybe with the Quebec and Ontario Eastern farmers. Try pushing it there. You have to ask your question to your federal milk care. They don't even have an MP in this province. And yet, and same as the rural NDP opposite don't have a rural member. We ran on 99 on choice, on free marketing. You think if the farmers were behind you, you think you'd have had farmers running for you. You think you'd have run some seats. You may want to look at that and maybe think maybe once you're wrong on something. Maybe it's time to move on and help farmers work to market in the system we're in the world economy that we're dealing in right now. You know, we talk about you know, market choice, and when I was door knocking, that's big with a lot of farmers. They were tired for years and years of being threatened with jail. I had a neighbour that actually had his truck impounded at the border. Tried taking 1 load of grain across because he needed some money. It was put in jail.
Well, I'd like to remind the member to address his remarks through the chair. I recognize the member for Arm River-Watrous.
That, you know, farmers were desperate in them times. You know, they were getting $4 to $5 to $6 across the border for durum for wheat. Initial price, $1.97. $1.98, Mr. Speaker, and not being able to sell it because the wheat board hadn't contracted, hadn't called a quota.
Think about it.
You know, and you can see that money across the border, and you're not allowed to go to it because in the wheat board's mind, they owned the wheat. As soon as you combined it, they owned it. It wasn't yours to market, it wasn't yours to sell, it wasn't yours to do anything except store it to when they decided to call it. You know, and they wondered why farmers asked for change in the marketing system and freedom. And you know, that's what we got. When we door knocked, that's what the majority of farmers wanted. And if the NDP want to live in the past, that's up to them. But it shows in the polling. I just heard today their polling's down. Their polling is down again, Mr. Speaker. Why? I hear that Mr. Lingerfelter is actually higher than the current leader right now. You know, maybe they ought to sit around and ask themselves some of them questions of why is that. When you start pushing the old ideas from the 70s and the 60s and the 50s, the way things were, well, things have moved on. We're working in a world economy now, working with huge agribusinesses. Farmers are willing to do that. They know how to market their own grain. They all own computers. They know the prices. They know the market. You know, if you're on an iPhone, a farmer's constantly getting updates of prices, of contracts availability, knowing when to move his grain. You know, that's what the farming business is nowadays, not sitting back and having some organization take a lot of the money and saying we'll sell it and not do that great of a job at it to begin with. The farmers right now want the freedom. They have the technology. They have the experience to do that job, and they're willing to do it, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, I still can't believe that they would actually bring something that far from the past instead of just saying, you know, how can we help the farming industry? What do we need in the future to move on? You think of all the motions they could bring forward that's happening out in rural Saskatchewan. You know, you'd think they'd want to talk about that, except some old idea that they just can't let go. It's something like the Regina Manifesto. If they had their way, I think they'd actually bring that back again. You know, they have to. I don't know why they won't look even in the present levy, always going to the back. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, myself and the farmers and ranchers of Arm River constituency will not be